So when looking at Isaiah, for some he is called the prophet who focuses on the redemption of God. For others, they think of him as the messianic prophet, mainly because of the wonderful foreshadowing prophetic passages like Isaiah 53, and some even call him the fifth evangelist. The prophet Isaiah is certainly the main connecting bridge between the Old and the New Covenants. In the New Testament, Isaiah is quoted far more than any other Old Testament prophet. He's mentioned 21 times by name, and chapter 53, Isaiah 53, is quoted directly or alluded to at least 85 times in the New Testament. Thinking about who wrote it, well, the opening verse of Isaiah claims that Isaiah himself is the author. The New Testament supports that view. John in chapter 12 quotes Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 53, and he attributes the quotes himself to Isaiah. The same is true of Matthew in chapter 3 and Luke in chapter 3, and in Acts they quote Isaiah and credit him. Furthermore, it's important to note that both Jewish and Christian traditions have universally attributed this book to Isaiah. Also, it's entirely reasonable to assume that Isaiah could predict the Babylonian captivity and the return under a Persian king 150 years in advance if one understands that he wrote under the inspiration of God. So who was the book written to? Well, Isaiah began his ministry at the end of Uzziah's reign, and he continued through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. He evidently outlived Hezekiah by at least a few years, because chapter 37 and 38 records the death of Sennacherib in 681 BC. Thus, the generation who lived in the southern kingdom about 680 BC were the recipients of the book. When Isaiah was a young man, Assyria was a great menacing power. Other nations wanted to form a coalition against the Assyrians, but King Uzziah would not join them. So Syria and the northern kingdom attacked the southern kingdom as a way to try and force her to cooperate with them against Assyria. Instead of trusting the Lord for help, Ahaz turned to Assyria for assistance. Assyria defeated the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and the southern kingdom became a vassal state to her. Isaiah told the people to trust the Lord, but others told the king to turn to Egypt for help. God gave Hezekiah the victory at the actual walls of Jerusalem, where he miraculously defeated Sennacherib of Assyria, and that's documented for us in Isaiah 37 and 38. So Isaiah is living through these turbulent times and writing to the people who are also living through these times. Although he ministered primarily to the southern kingdom, he warned Judah of judgment by Babylon, even though at that time Babylon had not risen to power. He delivered a warning to the northern kingdom, and he pronounced judgment on the Gentile nations of Babylon, Moab, Damascus, Egypt even, etc. But in doing so, he spoke to all the nations and all the people of the earth. Thinking about the message, God's servant Isaiah, as we said, he lived in Jerusalem, where he was in a sense an advisor to several kings of Judah. He was a person of importance, and over many years he used his position to try and influence Judah's policies in both local and international affairs. Isaiah saw that Assyria and Egypt, along with many other nations among Judah's neighbors, were opposed to Israel's God, who Isaiah knew was the one and only true God. The prophet therefore announced God's judgment upon each of them in turn. But he also saw that Judah was rebellious against God, and that the nation was heading for this terrible judgment. He foresaw that the people were going to be taken into captivity in a foreign land. But through all these events, he also predicted that God would preserve the remnant, the minority of people who would remain faithful to him. So the subject of the book is the salvation of God. The word salvation appears 26 times in the book. It only appears 7 times in the other prophets combined. Therefore, the message of Isaiah is simply God judges sin and brings salvation through the Messiah and his coming kingdom. So thinking about the structure of this book, most of the book is poetry. Chapters 1 to 35 are in the forms of poem, then there follows a short 4 passages of history, and then chapter 40 to the end of the book, chapter 66, are again prophecy. So thinking about the purposes, why this was written, well, many Bible experts believe that Isaiah had three main purposes. The first purpose was to preach against and thereby expose sin. There was political corruption and moral depravity everywhere during the time of Isaiah. And Isaiah not only exposed these evil things, he exposed the nation's basic sin and its wrong attitude in its relationship to God that was revealed so clearly in its idolatry. The second purpose of Isaiah is to pronounce judgment on the sinner. He pronounced judgment on the nations that sinned, on Babylon, Egypt, Moab, and Tyre, but also on Jerusalem itself. And the third purpose of Isaiah was to predict the coming salvation of God, not just for Israel, but for the whole world. Isaiah at a local level predicted that Assyria would not take the southern kingdom, but he also predicted the coming kingdom of God and the Messiah, and how that would be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So just to summarize this book in a single phrase, Isaiah the prophet denounces the sins of Judah and pronounces the judgment on Judah and the surrounding nations, but yet at the same time predicts the ultimate salvation of God in the Messiah and in the coming kingdom of God. Therefore showing that God judges sin, yet brings salvation through the death and resurrection of the suffering servant, the Messiah.